Hello everyone. Welcome to BYK Book Summary. I am Amin. Here we decode the inspiring journey, mental warfare, and empire building life lesson of the world's greatest legend. Today topics and their biggest secret are right on your screen. Let's dive in with my AI co-host.
Imagine looking at a composite satellite image of the Earth at night. You've probably seen one of those visualizations before, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The big glowing map.
Exactly. It's this massive glowing map of human activity just scattered across the dark marble of our planet. And, well, some areas like the eastern seaboard of the U.S. or Western Europe or the coast of Japan, they are just absolutely ablaze with light.
Right. It looks like a sprawling nervous system or something.
Yeah, just this interconnected web of electricity and infrastructure and industry. But then you pan your eyes across the rest of the globe and you see these massive, sprawling regions. I mean, entire subcontinents, vast stretches of landmass that are just mostly dark.
Just a few faint pinpricks of light.
Right, in an otherwise totally black void. And when you look at that map,
Yeah.
you are kind of confronted with this massive, almost uncomfortable question. Like, why?
Yeah, it really makes you wonder.
Look around the globe. Why are some nations staggeringly wealthy, practically glowing with prosperity, while others remain trapped in poverty, just seemingly locked in the dark?
It's the ultimate question.
Is the global economy just a rigged game? Is it like a geographic lottery where you either win or lose based entirely on where you happen to be born? Or is there some hidden underlying architecture to prosperity that we just aren't seeing?
It really is the ultimate diagnostic puzzle when we look at global economics,
Uh-huh.
We instinctively crave this single clean variable to explain it all. We want to point to a map and claim, oh, a country is rich because they have oil,
Right.
or they're poor because they suffered a recent war. But the moment you attempt to diagnose the wealth of nations with that really simple linear cause and effect machine, the logic just breaks down completely.
Because you find resource-rich nations in deep poverty, right?
Exactly. And then you find barren rocks with booming economies.
Yeah.
So what we're actually looking at is a multi-century chain reaction.
Which brings us to the core mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking the foundational arguments laid out in a summary of David Landis's landmark 1998 book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations.
Such an important piece of work.
It really is.
Yeah.
And our objective today is not to just, rattle off a timeline of historical events. The mission here is to fundamentally upgrade how you, the listener, view global affairs.
Yeah, we really want to change the perspective here.
We want to dismantle the way you look at geopolitics, international development, and honestly, even how you approach long-term investing. We are going to build a completely new framework for analyzing the world.
And, it is definitely worth noting the caliber of minds who rely on this exact framework.
Oh, for sure.
Like legendary investor Charlie Munger heavily recommended this specific text. Munger's entire philosophy was rooted in the understanding that the true wealth of a nation, like the genuine indicator of its long-term potential, is never going to be found in a quarterly spreadsheet.
Right, or like a temporary spike in GDP.
Exactly. True prosperity is embedded in a nation's culture, its historical institutions, and its societal norms. What's fascinating here is that to understand the modern financial world, we have to look way past the short-term economic data and dig into these centuries-long chain reactions that built the modern operating system of commerce.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how we arrived at the glowing satellite map of today, we have to kind of rewind the clock and examine the physical board that this global game was played on, right?
Yeah, the baseline starting point.
Let's talk about the geographic lottery. Because Landis begins his entire thesis with the physical world, contrasting temperate climates with tropical climates.
Right.
And the baseline argument is that, historically, temperate climates supported much greater agricultural productivity. But the sources point out something much more visceral and honestly terrifying about tropical regions.
The disease burden.
Yes. The staggering compounding burden of disease.
Geography absolutely dictates the initial starting capital of a society. And I'm not talking about gold or silver here.
Right, you mean human capital.
Exactly. Human energy. In the sources, Landis points specifically to the endemic nature of tropical diseases. So malaria and sleeping sickness being the prime examples.
Yeah.
We're so conditioned to view disease solely as a humanitarian tragedy, which it is, of course, but we rarely examine it as a fundamental macroeconomic headwind.
That's a great point.
Think about the biological mechanics of early agrarian wealth creation. The basic unit of production is just human labor.
Right, muscle.
It's calories expended to clear land, to grow food, to build shelter, and crucially, to create a surplus.
So if you are living in a temperate zone
Mhm.
with harsh, freezing winters, I mean, that winter is terrible to endure, obviously.
Very harsh.
But it acts as a massive biological reset button, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The frost kills off pests, it neutralizes disease vectors. The environment is brutal, sure, but it offers a predictable seasonal rhythm.
Yes, the predictability is the key there.
Yeah.
Now shift that lens to a tropical environment where there is no deep freeze.
No reset button.
Exactly. Parasites, bacteria, and insect vectors just thrive year-round. So when a massive percentage of a population is constantly battling malaria, we have to look at the caloric economics of that reality.
The caloric economics, I like that phrasing.
Yeah, well, think about it. A human body fighting off a severe malarial fever is burning thousands of calories just to survive the infection.
Wow.
The lethargy, the destruction of red blood cells, it physically drains the workforce. In a subsistence economy, that is a massive percentage of your society's agricultural yield being burned up just keeping bodies alive.
It's basically a biological tax.
A huge tax.
Yeah.
That is human energy that cannot be used to harvest extra crops, invent new tools, or build complex infrastructure.
The disease burden acts like a massive leak in the hull of a ship. Like you are bailing water and just pouring your labor into survival, but the biological tax is draining your reserves before you can ever accumulate a surplus.
Perfectly said.
Without a surplus, you just can't invest in the future.
It cascades into every single facet of society. The sources also mention sleeping sickness, right? Which is carried by the tsetse fly across vast swaths of sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
And this disease doesn't just devastate human populations, it is universally fatal to draft animals.
Wait, universally fatal.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
Horses, oxen, cattle, they simply cannot survive in the tsetse fly belt.
Oh, wow.
Think about the economic implications of a world without draft animals. You can't rely on an ox to pull a heavy iron plow. You can't use horses to transport bulk goods over long distances.
Oh, I see where this is going. That implies a world without effective wheels.
Exactly.
Because if you don't have large animals to pull a cart, the wheel loses a massive amount of its utility. Everything from deep plowing to long-distance freight has to be executed by human muscle alone.
Which instantly caps your societal output. If human muscle is the only engine available to you, your crop yields are basically biologically limited.
Right.
And if your yields are capped, almost every single person in your society has to be dedicated to farming just to stave off starvation.
You're just constantly treading water.
Exactly. You never achieve the massive agricultural surplus necessary to support a dedicated, specialized class of blacksmiths or engineers, scholars, inventors.
Yeah.
The entire progression of human civilization just gets stalled at the agrarian baseline because the biological tax imposed by the geography is simply too high to pay.
That is a fascinating yet totally brutal geographic constraint. And the sources layer another physical barrier on top of that too, which is the landscape itself.
Oh, the topography.
Right. There's this incredible analogy regarding rivers, comparing the river systems of Europe to those of Africa. It really illustrates how the physical earth either naturally integrates a society or forcibly fractures it.
Yeah, this is one of the most profound geographical concepts we have to analyze here. Look at the topography of Europe. It's crisscrossed with these slow, deep, highly navigable rivers.
Like the Rhine.
The Rhine, the Danube, the Thames. Historically, these rivers functioned as natural pre-industrial superhighways. The physics of water transport are incredibly favorable. Floating a barge down a river requires exponentially less energy and friction than dragging a cart over muddy, unpaved terrain.
Oh, sure. Night-day difference.
So a farmer or a merchant in, say, medieval Germany could load tons of grain or timber onto a barge and access a completely different market hundreds of miles away with minimal transaction costs.
Because the barrier to trade is so low, commerce just naturally flows. And where commerce flows, human interaction actually flows. You get this massive cross-pollination of ideas, technologies, and cultures.
Exactly.
The rivers basically act as a circulatory system for innovation.
Integration is the byproduct of navigable waterways. Now, contrast that geographic layout with the interior rivers of Africa as detailed by Landis. We have to look at the continental plate structure.
Okay.
Africa is essentially a massive elevated plateau. So while the continent possesses massive, powerful river systems like the Congo or the Zambezi, there's a fundamental structural problem.
What happens?
As these massive rivers make their way from the interior plateau down to the coastal oceans, they drop off the escarpment.
Oh, I see. They turn into massive waterfalls and violent rapids.
Yeah, unnavigable cataracts. You simply cannot sail a cargo vessel from the ocean deep into the interior of the continent.
Right.
You sail inland for perhaps 50 or 100 miles, and then you just hit an impassable wall of rushing water, like the Inga Falls on the Congo.
So if Europe's navigable rivers are natural superhighways that build wealth, these waterfalls act as massive physical walls.
Walls, exactly.
They shatter the landscape into isolated pockets.
They fracture potential markets and completely isolate communities. If you want to move bulk goods past these cataracts, you are forced into a process called portaging.
Portaging, what does that entail?
You have to completely unload your vessels, carry the cargo on human backs, and remember, no draft animals due to the tsetse fly.
Oh, right, back to the tsetse fly.
Yeah, so you trek through dense jungle around the rapids, carrying all this weight, and then you reload everything onto new boats on the other side.
That sounds miserable.
It is. The transaction costs, the time, and the sheer human effort required make long-distance bulk trade economically unviable. And isolation is the absolute enemy of innovation.
Because they aren't interacting.
Right. When communities are geographically barred from trading easily, they do not exchange ideas. The landscape basically enforces a structural stagnation.
Okay, I follow the logic, but I have to push back here a little bit.
Go for it.
Because this framework feels dangerously close to absolute determinism. It sounds like we're saying that if you happen to sit on a deep river with a cold winter, you are destined for wealth. And if you are surrounded by mosquitoes and waterfalls, you are just doomed to poverty.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
But if geography dictates destiny with absolute certainty, then a place with almost zero natural resources, a place constantly battered by seismic activity, should be totally destitute. So what about Japan?
That is the crucial pivot point right there. That exact realization elevates Landis's argument from a basic geography lesson into a profound analysis of human civilization. Japan is the ultimate counterexample to geographic determinism. It's a volcanic archipelago. It is profoundly lacking in domestic natural resources.
Yeah, they have almost nothing.
Very little arable land, roughly 15% of its landmass, is suitable for agriculture. Historically, it had barely any oil, coal, or iron ore compared to the great continental powers of Europe or North America.
Right.
And it is constantly subjected to earthquakes and typhoons. By the pure rules of the geographic lottery we just established, Japan should be a marginalized, impoverished nation just clinging to survival.
Yet they stand as one of the most advanced, wealthy, and highly industrialized economies on the planet.
Exactly.
Which suggests that the physical board you are playing on is merely the starting hand in a poker game. It sets the initial conditions, but it does not determine the final score of the match.
That is the perfect distinction. Geography establishes the baseline. It hands you your initial constraints and advantages. But human agency, specifically executed through the operating system of culture, determines what a society builds on top of that baseline.
The operating system of culture. I like that.
And this brings us out of the physical landscape and into the mental landscape. This is the phenomenon historians refer to as the Great Divergence.
The Great Divergence.
Why did some societies take whatever raw materials they had and explode into modernity, while others, sometimes with vastly superior natural wealth, just stagnated?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because Landis posits that culture is the ultimate decisive factor in long-run economic development. The sources lay out what we could basically frame as a prosperity culture checklist.
Yeah, let's go through it.
It's fascinating because it doesn't read like traditional economic theory at all. The traits that reliably predict long-term wealth are deeply embedded societal values. Like a society that fundamentally values curiosity, a culture that actively rewards innovation instead of viewing it with suspicion or fear, a society that prioritizes the education of its women, and a culture that maintains a strict, objective rule of law.
We really need to pause and examine the mechanics of that list, because while it sounds pretty straightforward to a modern ear, achieving those cultural norms historically is incredibly rare.
Really?
Oh yeah. Let's analyze the education of women, for example. If you are trying to diagnose why a specific nation remains economically depressed, the very first metric you should evaluate is how they treat half of their population.
Makes sense.
If a culture, driven by tradition or religious dogma, actively restricts women from education and economic participation, we have to look at the mathematical reality of that choice.
Right.
They are voluntarily sidelining 50% of their intellectual capital. They are throwing away half of their potential innovators, doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs. It is basically an act of macroeconomic self-mutilation.
It's the equivalent of trying to win an arms race while voluntarily dismantling half of your factories. The math simply does not allow you to compete globally.
Exactly. And the societies that historically decided to educate everyone saw massive compounding returns on that human capital. But the most traumatic example of culture acting as a catalyst for an economic explosion in the sources actually originates outside the realm of economics entirely. It begins as a theological shift.
Oh, you're talking about the European literacy boom. This is one of those historical chain reactions that completely rewires how you view the modern world.
Yeah.
We were talking about the Protestant Reformation.
Yes.
Usually the Reformation is taught strictly as a religious dispute, right? Like Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door, debates over indulgences, and a schism within the Catholic Church.
But the macroeconomic fallout of that theological dispute was totally earth-shattering.
It's wild.
What's fascinating here is the specific mechanism of cultural change. The Protestant Reformation introduced Exactly. The Reformation argued that every single individual must have a direct, unmediated relationship with the Bible. You had to read the text yourself to save your soul.
Which introduces an incredibly urgent imperative. I mean, suddenly you have a society-wide mandate to teach an entire continent of peasant farmers, tradesmen, and laborers how to actually read.
Consider the sheer logistical undertaking of that cultural shift.
It's massive.
For the first time in human history, we see a mass mobilization toward literacy that is not reserved for the elite. It isn't just for aristocrats or monks in monasteries. It is for the blacksmith, the baker, the farmer's wife, and their children.
Right.
Entire societies across Northern Europe began mobilizing resources to teach their populations to read the vernacular language, so German, English, Dutch. This was fundamentally a religious initiative driven entirely by faith and the fear of damnation.
But the accidental massive economic byproduct is the creation of a highly literate workforce.
Yes, and mass literacy physically and culturally changes the neurobiology of a society.
Yes.
Well, when a population transitions from a purely oral tradition, where knowledge is memorized, static, and passed down through local stories, to a literate tradition, their capacity for complex, abstract thought expands exponentially.
Oh, I see.
If a farmer can read the Book of Genesis in his native language, he can also read a ledger. He can read a printed manual from a neighboring country detailing new methods of crop rotation or animal husbandry.
Or he can read a blueprint for an improved water wheel.
Exactly.
That literacy creates an indestructible bedrock for compounding knowledge. In an oral tradition, if a guy invents a better plow, maybe his village learns about it, but the idea probably dies with him.
It's lost.
But in a literate society, he writes it down and it gets printed. A month later, an engineer 3 countries away reads about that plow, improves the design, and publishes an updated version. The friction of sharing ideas just drops to zero.
And that feedback loop is the intellectual foundation of the scientific revolution. Scientists and tinkerers could publish their findings, debate theories across borders, and peer review each other's work through correspondence and journals.
Wow.
And that scientific revolution leads directly to the Industrial Revolution. The mechanization of textiles, the development of the steam engine, the complex metallurgy required to harness coal, none of these breakthroughs happen in a vacuum.
They need a foundation.
They required a baseline society where thousands of mechanics, foremen, and everyday tinkerers can read blueprints, execute basic math, and understand abstract concepts.
Right.
The staggering wealth of Northern Europe wasn't solely built because they happened to be sitting on coal deposits. It was built on a cultural operating system that accidentally taught its entire population to read in the pursuit of religious salvation.
Which makes the contrasting historical example so utterly tragic. Because if we want to see the dark mirror to the European literacy boom, the sources provide the devastating case study of the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, this one is just brutal.
To fully grasp this, we have to establish the sheer scale of Ottoman dominance. We're not talking about a struggling peripheral state here. At their zenith, the Ottoman Empire led the entire world in military logistics, architectural engineering, wealth accumulation, and academic scholarship.
They were the peak.
They controlled the central node of global trade connecting East and West.
They were the undisputed superpower of their era. They possessed access to the greatest libraries, the most lucrative trade routes, and incredibly diverse human capital.
Yeah.
By all geographic and historical metrics, the Ottoman Empire was perfectly positioned to be the society that led humanity into the modern industrial age.
But then we hit the ultimate sliding doors moment in global history, the arrival of the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg develops the movable type printing press in Europe around 1440.
Yep.
And it is arguably the single most important information distribution technology since the invention of written language itself. It takes the cost of reproducing a book and completely collapses it.
And when this technology, this absolute miracle machine that democratizes knowledge, arrives at the borders of the immensely powerful Ottoman Empire, the religious and political authorities ban it.
They ban it.
And they don't just ban it for a decade to study its effects. The sources emphasize a staggering timeline. They effectively banned the printing of Arabic and Turkish characters for nearly 200 years.
We really need to pause and absorb the magnitude of that specific cultural decision. 200 years.
Yeah.
In human terms, we're talking about 8 to 10 generations of people.
It's hard to even fathom.
Why?
Yeah.
Why would the leaders of the most advanced empire on Earth look at a machine that prints books and declare it illegal?
We have to look at the political mechanics of fear.
Fear.
The ban was driven by a deep cultural and religious fear of losing narrative control. In the Ottoman Empire, there was a massive, highly influential social class of scribes and calligraphers. Furthermore, the religious scholars, the ulema, held a monopoly on the interpretation of sacred texts and legal decrees. They looked at the printing press, and they just saw uncontrollable chaos.
They saw a threat?
Exactly. They reasoned that if anyone could cheaply print a book, then anyone could print heresy. Anyone could distribute political dissent. The gatekeepers of knowledge recognized that the printing press would obliterate their monopoly on truth and their societal status.
Right.
So, to preserve short-term political stability, to protect the jobs of the scribes, and to maintain social order, they utilized the power of the state to outlaw the machine. It was essentially an extreme form of regulatory capture.
I think about that in modern terms, and it is the equivalent of a powerful nation today deciding to completely ban the internet just to protect the business model of the Postal Service and local newspapers.
That is a highly accurate comparison.
They prioritize the comfort of the status quo over the exponential growth of the future.
Because it highlights the destruction of network effects. By banning the press, they essentially locked their entire society in an intellectual time capsule while the rest of the world just hit fast forward.
Wow.
Think about the compound interest of a 2-century knowledge deficit. While Western Europe is printing specialized scientific journals, arguing over planetary orbits, standardizing complex mathematics, and distributing medical encyclopedias, the Ottoman scholars are still relying on a slow, expensive trickle of hand-copied manuscripts.
The iteration of ideas basically grinds to a halt. You simply cannot compete in a global economy when your velocity of information is moving at a fraction of the speed of your rivals.
The gap that opened up between the Ottoman Empire and Western Europe over those 200 years was not merely a gap in the volume of books available. It was an unrecoverable, compounding technological and economic chasm.
Unrecoverable.
Yes. By the time the Ottomans finally relented and allowed mass printing, the damage was permanent. The West was already beginning to industrialize. They had advanced metallurgy, modern banking and credit systems, and early steam power. The Ottomans could not just flip a switch and catch up.
It validates Landa's central thesis perfectly. The slow collapse of Ottoman dominance was not caused by a sudden lack of natural resources or a shift in the geographic lottery.
No, not at all.
They had abundant resources. They made a deliberate cultural choice to punish innovation because it frightened the establishment, and that cultural choice became an economic death sentence.
Which naturally leads us to the most vital question of macroeconomics. How do you prevent a society from making that exact mistake?
Right.
How do you ensure that a culture continues to value curiosity and reward innovation, not just for one lucky generation, but across centuries? Because culture is fluid, you know?
Yeah, it changes.
It's just a collection of shared beliefs, and beliefs can shift, fade, or be corrupted by fear. How do you take a prosperity culture and make it stick permanently?
Well, that brings us to the architecture of incentive. Institutions. You have to take those cultural values and hardwire them into the literal legal framework of the society.
Precisely.
According to the deep dive sources, the absolute bedrock of these institutions, the foundation upon which all modern wealth is built, is the concept of property rights.
The psychology of ownership. This is the exact intersection where abstract macroeconomic theory meets raw human nature.
I love this part.
To understand why property rights are the engine of prosperity, we need to break down two vastly different psychological states that society can operate under. Let's classify them as State A, driven by institutional security, and State B, driven by institutional fear.
Okay, let's set the parameters for State A. What does that environment look like?
In State A, the rule of law is supreme and objective. Property rights are ironclad and legally defended. Imagine you are an agricultural laborer or a small farmer.
Okay, I'm a farmer.
You know, with absolute legal certainty that the field you clear, the wheat you plant, and the harvest you yield belongs entirely to you. You understand that after paying a predictable, formally agreed upon tax rate, the entire surplus of your labor is yours to keep.
Nice.
You can sell it, you can reinvest it, or you can pass it down to your children.
The psychological incentive there is incredibly powerful. If I know my property is secure, my rational response is to work as relentlessly as possible.
Of course.
I'm going to wake up earlier to clear an extra acre. I'm going to experiment with a new, riskier type of seed. I'm going to dig irrigation ditches. Because every single drop of sweat, every ounce of extra effort I deploy, translates directly into increased wealth for my family.
Exactly. The institution guarantees the reward. Now let's scale that psychology up to a craftsman or an inventor in State A.
Okay.
Suppose you dedicate 5 years of your life sacrificing immediate income to design a more efficient mechanical water pump. In State A, the legal institution of intellectual property, like the patent, protects your design. You know that a wealthy aristocrat or a larger competitor cannot simply steal your blueprints. The state will enforce your monopoly on that invention for a set time. Because that guarantee exists, you are willing to take the massive risk of innovating in the first place.
Makes total sense. Now, let's contrast that by looking at State B, a society operating under the psychology of fear.
In State B, institutions are weak, corrupt, or basically non-existent. The power of the state, the monarch, or the local warlord is absolute and unchecked. True property rights just do not exist.
That sounds stressful.
You are that exact same farmer with the exact same work ethic and intelligence, but you live under the constant reality that at any given moment, the king's tax collectors, a corrupt local governor, or a passing military garrison can arbitrarily seize your harvest.
Just take it.
Yeah, they can confiscate your land without compensation or demand a ruinous, unpredictable bribe just to let you operate.
How does that alter your behavior? I mean, it completely breaks the incentive structure. Why on earth would I exhaust myself clearing an extra acre of land? If I work incredibly hard and produce a massive, highly visible surplus of grain, it doesn't make me wealthy, it makes me a target.
Exactly.
I'm essentially painting a bullseye on my back for corrupt officials to come rob me.
In State B, humans rationally choose to minimize their effort. They produce exactly enough calories to survive and not a single grain more.
Because what's the point?
Exactly. If they do acquire wealth, they do not invest it in visible productive assets. They hide it. They bury coins in the forest. They certainly do not build a massive, highly efficient flour mill, because the moment that mill becomes profitable, the local pasha or lord will simply appropriate it.
Why build a beautiful mansion if the king can just claim it? You just outlined the exact recipe for permanent societal stagnation. No one builds, no one invests capital, no one takes entrepreneurial risks. The institutional architecture punishes success and rewards hiding.
And this is where the historical example of England becomes paramount in the sources, because England did not simply wake up one morning in the 18th century with perfect modern institutions. It was a brutal, slow burn.
Right.
The text traces the gradual evolution of the rule of law in England, anchoring it all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215.
That is a crucial pivot point. And we shouldn't just gloss over the Magna Carta as some dusty piece of parchment either. This was born out of intense friction.
Oh, massive friction.
You have King John severely depleting the national treasury on failed military campaigns in France, arbitrarily taxing his barons, a tax called scutage, and just seizing estates at whim. The baronial rebellion forces the king to sign a document that establishes a radical precedent. The monarch is not above the law.
It decoupled the allocation of capital from the arbitrary whim of the ruler.
Right.
It was the very first incredibly fragile step towards state A. And I want to emphasize the word evolution. It required centuries of institutional refinement.
It wasn't overnight.
Not at all. It took violent civil wars, the establishment of independent judiciaries, and the evolution of common law where precedent matters more than decree. It culminated in events like the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which definitively secured property rights and allowed for the creation of public credit and the Bank of England.
Which changes everything.
By the time we arrive at the 18th century, England has cultivated a unique environment. A merchant launching a joint stock company knows his cargo is protected by contract law. An inventor knows the statute of monopolies will uphold his patent in an independent court.
That is the true catalyst. The Industrial Revolution occurs in England not simply because they had massive deposits of coal lying around. Plenty of regions globally had abundant coal.
Right, China had plenty of coal.
Exactly. It happened there because they spent half a millennium painstakingly building an environment of predictable incentives. The coal was merely the physical fuel. The objective rule of law was the actual engine of industrialization.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this represents the profound shift in perspective that Landis is offering. National wealth is not dug out of the earth. Wealth is constructed out of laws, habits, societal trust, and institutional guarantees.
I love that.
A nation's prosperity is a direct reflection of how effectively it aligns human psychological incentives with institutional rewards.
So what does this all mean for us today? We have journeyed through the biology of tropical zones, the massive cultural shifts of the Protestant Reformation, the tragic regulatory capture of the Ottoman Empire, and the bloody evolution of English common law.
It's been quite the ride.
It is a sweeping historical narrative. But I want to bring this directly back to the reality of you, the listener. Because we established at the beginning that Charlie Munger utilized this exact historical framework to make highly pragmatic decisions in modern global markets.
Yes, he did.
How does a modern investor, or even just a citizen trying to understand the news, apply the lessons of a 15th century printing press ban to today's hyper-connected economy?
Well, this is where we apply the Munger lens. Munger was legendary for violently rejecting surface-level, easily manipulated metrics.
Okay.
If you are attempting to evaluate the long-term viability of a nation today, whether you are a multinational corporation deciding where to build a billion-dollar semiconductor fabrication plant, or an individual evaluating international mutual funds for your retirement portfolio, Munger would advise you to completely disregard short-term GDP figures.
Because a GDP print is just a rear-view mirror snapshot.
Yeah.
It tells you what economic activity occurred last quarter, but it reveals absolutely nothing about the structural integrity of the system moving forward.
Nothing at all.
A nation can experience a massive temporary spike in GDP simply because they discovered a new lithium deposit, or the global spot price of copper surged. But if their underlying institutions mirror state B, if they are rotten, that wealth will inevitably evaporate or be siphoned off by oligarchs and corruption.
Short-term economic data is largely noise. The underlying institutions and cultural norms are the true signal. Drawing from Landis' historical analysis, we can synthesize a modern prosperity checklist.
Okay.
It is a framework of deep, structural inquiries that cut through the noise of daily financial media.
I want to walk through how a modern thinker applies this. How do we measure these abstract concepts today?
The first, most critical inquiry is the rule of law objectively strong? And we must distinguish between paper laws and reality.
Right. Anyone can write a good law.
Having a beautifully written constitution is meaningless. Many failed states boast incredible constitutional documents. The functional test is this. If a foreign technology firm builds a state-of-the-art facility in this country, and a powerful local politician decides he wants to seize it or force a transfer of its intellectual property, will the local judiciary side with the law, or will they yield to political pressure?
That's the real test.
If the rule of law is subjective or vulnerable to political influence, the environment is inherently unstable.
Capital is notoriously cowardly. It will always flee from the arbitrary fear of State B and flow toward the predictable security of State A. If a court cannot uphold a basic contract against state pressure, long-term investment will eventually vanish.
The second inquiry is intellectual property fiercely protected. This is the modern iteration of the English craftsman's patent.
Okay.
If a biomedical startup spends $1 billion developing a novel therapeutic drug, or a software company writes a revolutionary algorithmic code, does the state apparatus actively protect that intellectual property? Or does it look the other way while state-sponsored actors pirate, reverse engineer, and illegally distribute it?
That mirrors the exact psychology we discussed. Why would a company deploy massive capital into research and development if a rival can simply copy their homework with zero legal repercussions?
They wouldn't.
If a nation tolerates IP theft, they might experience a short-term economic sugar rush by acquiring cheap technology, but they completely destroy the internal incentive for their own citizens to ever invent anything novel. They guarantee they will always be a follower, never a leader.
The third inquiry centers on human capital. Are women fully educated and actively participating in all levels of the economy? As we analyzed earlier, this remains one of the most brutally accurate predictors of a nation's macroeconomic trajectory.
It's just simple math.
If you are evaluating a region where cultural norms, religious dictates, or lack of infrastructure actively suppress female education or workforce integration, you are analyzing a system voluntarily operating at half capacity. It is mathematically impossible for them to compete over a multi-decade horizon against a society that is firing on all cylinders, utilizing 100% of its talent pool.
And what is the final structural question we should be asking?
Does the culture instinctively reward innovation, or does it attempt to punish and restrict it to protect the status quo? This brings us full circle to the Ottoman scribes and the printing press. Observe how a country reacts today when a massively disruptive new technology emerges. Think about artificial intelligence, decentralized finance, or synthetic biology. Does the government and the broader culture attempt to understand, integrate, and harness the disruption? Or is there immediate reflex to ban it, heavily restrict it, and pass labyrinthine regulations specifically designed to protect the legacy industries that feel threatened?
That is an incredibly clarifying lens. Are they building bridges to adapt to the future, or are they desperately building regulatory walls to protect the profits of the past?
If you can evaluate a nation and find favorable answers to those structural questions, secure property rights, protected innovation, full human capital utilization, and a cultural embrace of disruption, you have identified a system with a massive compounding advantage. Charlie Munger understood that if the cultural and institutional operating system is robust, the economic outputs, the wealth, will eventually take care of themselves.
That framework cuts through so much daily political and economic noise. It is like having X-ray vision for the global economy.
It really is.
It explains why a nation blessed with vast reserves of oil or minerals can remain mired in poverty for decades. It isn't a failure of geography. It is a failure of institutions. And conversely, it explains why a tiny, resource-starved island nation can build a booming, high-tech economy. You learn to see the invisible cultural architecture holding it all up.
It forces us to realize that wealth is not a natural state of human existence. Poverty is the default state of nature. Wealth is a highly unnatural construct that must be deliberately engineered and aggressively maintained.
Let's summarize the massive arc we have traveled today, because we have really dismantled the globe and put it back together. We began with David Lance's central observation that global inequality is stark and undeniable. We analyzed the physical board, acknowledging that geography imposes severe constraints, tropical disease burdens like malaria inflict massive caloric deficits, and unnavigable African river systems shatter potential trade networks, proving that geography absolutely sets the initial difficulty level of a society.
But as the rise of resource-poor Japan demonstrated, geography is not a life sentence. The game is ultimately played and won through culture.
Culture is the engine. We saw how the Protestant Reformation's theological demand for personal scripture reading accidentally ignited a cognitive revolution. It forced mass literacy, rewiring European society for abstract thought and laying the track for the scientific and industrial revolutions.
Incredible transition.
And in tragic contrast, we examined how the Ottoman Empire voluntarily paralyzed its own intellectual and economic development for 2 centuries. They allowed the fear of narrative disruption to justify banning the printing press, locking themselves out of modernity.
And we learned that to ensure society doesn't backslide into fear, those cultural values must be codified into institutions. The psychology of property rights is paramount. We trace the agonizingly slow evolution of English common law from the baronial pushback of the Magna Carta to modern contract law, illustrating how a predictable environment incentivizes humans to build, take risks, and compound their wealth, free from the terror of arbitrary state seizure.
It is a profoundly cohesive narrative. Geography, biology, religious history, legal precedents, and modern economics. They aren't isolated academic subjects. They interlock to form one unified explanation of the modern world. Prosperity is not a winning lottery ticket. It is an active choice, made generation after generation through the diligent maintenance of a society's culture and its institutions.
This raises an important question, though, and this is the thought I want to leave you with today.
Okay.
We spent a significant amount of time analyzing the Ottoman Empire's rejection of the printing press. Sitting here centuries later, with the benefit of hindsight, it is incredibly easy for us to judge them.
Right. It seems so obvious now.
We scoff and say, oh, how remarkably foolish. Why would you ban the printing press? It simply prints books. But we have to realize they didn't see it as just a machine for books. They looked at it and saw a terrifying, uncontrollable force that fundamentally threatened their social hierarchy, their religious truth, and their political stability. From their perspective, within their specific cultural context, the decision to ban it was a highly rational act of self-preservation. It was driven by a very human, very understandable fear of the unknown.
Their entire worldview was under threat. The disruption was real.
So project that psychology onto the modern world. Look at the horizon we are approaching today. We are standing at the precipice of technological leaps that will make the societal disruption of the printing press look like a minor ripple.
Oh, sure.
Artificial general intelligence, advanced quantum computing, CRISPR and genetic engineering. These are technologies that will fundamentally rewrite the nature of labor, the structure of the global economy, and perhaps even what it means to be human.
And frankly, these technologies are terrifying.
They are. They legitimately threaten massive legacy industries, they threaten domestic social stability, and they threaten the current balance of geopolitical power. If a powerful nation today, perhaps even the nation you live in right now, were to let that exact same instinctual fear drive them to heavily restrict, heavily regulate, or outright ban the next great technological leap, could they accidentally enforce their own centuries-long era of stagnation?
Wow.
Could a modern society, acting right now out of an abundance of caution and a desire for short-term stability, be making a regulatory decision that effectively hands the future of global prosperity over to their geopolitical rivals?
Are we, in our own way, banning the printing press right now, and we've just lacked the historical distance to realize it?
Exactly the question we must ask. When you look at that satellite image of the Earth at night and you see those bright glowing clusters of prosperity, remember that the lights do not stay on by accident. They are kept on by the choices a culture makes when faced with the future. Let that thought steep.
So, friends, that was the complete breakdown. Make sure to take a screenshot of this growth gift, this infographic, so this lesson stay with you. If you want to learn from legends every single day, join our community. I am Amin. Always remember, read more, think deeper. Let me know in the comments who we should cover next. See you in next episode.